everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for today's episode. I just got off of a Zoom call with a bunch of other pro staff with the Pure Fishing brands, Berkeley and Abu Garcia, and I got to tell you, there's some really cool stuff coming down the line. I cannot wait to get my hands on some of it. I can't talk about it quite yet, but it's stuff that I think a lot of you guys will be really happy to have. I think you're going to catch a bunch of fish with some of these new baits coming out. I think the reels are going to be awesome. I mean, I'm really excited. I am kind of blown away by how much new stuff is coming out. You know, most companies release one or two baits here and there, and in this case, I feel like there's a whole bunch of stuff. Almost so much it's hard to grasp everything that they talked about today. But you'll start seeing that stuff trickling out here sometime in the next couple of months. Throughout the year, it's not going to be a single release. It's going to be a year-long thing, but I'm really excited about it. So today, guys, one of the baits that I want to talk about is a bait that I know will work fantastically on brake lines. You know, something here that we do up in the upper Midwest that is just absolutely killer is fishing brake lines. And it's something that no matter where you go across the lake, you have a brake line. And when I talk about brake line, what I'm talking about is you've got your initial shoreline that comes off the bank, and then at some point on a lot of lakes, you'll get a quick drop. That brake line, that drop is what I'm talking about. So you're fishing the first drop off of the shoreline is really what it comes down to. Some shorelines have the brake that come right off the bank. A lot of other shorelines may have 2 or 3 or 5 feet of water that comes off, and it could just be straight sand and then drops off into 15 feet. The drop itself is very much relative to the body of water you're fishing on. You know, if you're fishing some of the gin clear natural lakes here, a lot of times you have sand and gravel that come out till 8 feet of water. That then drops off into much deeper water. But it's that initial break line off of the shoreline that I want to talk about today. It very much is overlooked. A lot of times people, immediately want to go to points, humps, saddles, really classic structure. But I got to tell you, the brake line has all of that in it if you look close. You may just not have a very, very defined point or a very defined, hump or something that comes off of it. But really what you've got is that first main holding area off of the hard shoreline. And there's a lot of fish of all species that hold on that brake line. When they're active, they move up onto that flat to feed, and then they move back to that brake line for a safety and kind of just be in a more lethargic mode, because that's the first deep water off of the shoreline. So the brake lines hold fish across the country. They can be fantastic to fish if you know what you're looking for. A lot of times, if you're on a natural lake that has a lot of grass in it, the brake line and the grass line go hand in hand, because a lot of times you'll get grass that grows out to a certain depth, and then the brake line drops from, say, 8 feet to 20 feet, and the grass ends at that 8 foot or 10 foot mark on the brake line. So that can even be a really good thing to look for. So that's what I want to talk about today is how do you break down a brake line and capitalize on this area, because a lot of times the brake line stretches the entire lake. So if you've got 40 miles of shoreline, it can be overwhelming as to where to start on that brake line. So that's what I want to talk about today, are the high percentage spots. The first thing that I always do is I look at the contour lines on the brake lines themselves. What I'm looking for are two things. One, the tightest contour lines. I want the quickest, hardest, fastest drop on that brake line. So I'm looking for that. Where are the contour lines the tightest? And then once I find that, I'm looking for where those tight contour lines actually slowly start to separate, so you get a tapered off drop off. The tight brake lines definitely provide you more of that ledge. And anytime you have a ledge, the fish utilize that as a good feeding advantage, where they can push bait fish, whether it's shad or bluegill or perch, whatever it is they're feeding on, they will use that sharp brake line to push fish into, to use it to help them forage. So that's a really key thing to look for. The other contour lines that I'm looking for, like I said, are where it starts to slowly separate. And that is just a classic feeding spot. That's a classic staging spot where the fish will sit right on the edge of that sharp break line, right as that taper kind of starts to taper off. And they just use that. I can't tell you specifically why they're using that, but I can tell you that that is probably the most high percentage spot. Envision a bluff and a bluff end. The bluff ends are generally going to be the best part of the bluff. So the steep break line is the same thing. You've got your steep break line, and then you've kind of got your bluff ends or the break line ends where the contour lines start to taper off. So those are really good places to look for. Once you've identified those types of things, you can also look for isolated targets. So by isolated targets, I'm talking maybe a weed clump, a brush pile, a small rock pile, anything along a break line that could be a straight, simple, do nothing break line will hold fish because of the fact that it creates a holding spot on an otherwise do nothing bank. So anytime you have a piece of isolated target on a bank that normally would be bare or have nothing else, those fish will gravitate to it because it's the only isolated pieces of structure for them to hold on and to use to try to ambush prey as it's going by. So if you can, if you have the capability of side imaging down a bank, you can idle for miles, and you may only find one or two pieces of isolated cover, but generally those pieces are going to have fish on them and continue to reload. So that's something you always want to look for. So you've also got little irregularities in the break line. You usually do not just have a straight break line that just runs perfectly with the bank. What you'll have is a break line that will run for the most part similar to what the bank's doing or what that break line's doing in the water, but you'll have little indentations, little tiny points, little, like I said, contour line changes. Those are the irregularities that you want to identify. Those are the things that will show you where the fish are holding. So again, it's one of those things you may not just want to fish down the entire break line. You may want to, idle, or if you're a kayaker, paddle your way to the next irregularity, fish that, and then just continue moving versus fishing all of the break line in between those areas, because those are not high percentage areas compared to the irregularities that are either in the contour lines themselves or in some isolated cover that you can find. So that's really important. Another thing that you want to recognize is the mode of the fish. If the fish are in a very active feeding mode, they're generally going to be on top of the break line. That's where they're going to push bait to. That's where they're going to be up feeding. If they're not feeding, they're generally going to be at the bottom of the break line. So if you're fishing a break line that goes from 10 to 20 feet, if it's a cold front conditions, post front conditions, or the fish are just not actively feeding, they'll probably be down in that 20-foot mark versus at 10-foot mark when they're actively feeding. It's something that you want to be, very much aware of while you're out there. The last thing about break lines is the fact that the depth is kind of relative to where you're fishing. If you're on a Florida lake and you have a break line that drops from 4 to 8 feet, that is a good break line in Florida. Versus here, maybe a 4 to 8 foot break line isn't that big of a deal. Or say on Smith Lake in Alabama, you may be looking more for break lines that go from 20 to 50 feet. So it's all kind of relative based on where you're fishing. But the point here is if you have a 3-foot drop, that could be enough to hold fish. So you don't want to necessarily just be like, okay, I need to find a break line that drops 20 feet. It could be a 2-foot. It could be a 2-foot drop on Lake St. Clair. A 2-foot drop is a big ordeal, and that will hold fish. So you just want to be aware of what lake you're on and what those drops are going to be like. I've got an example here of a break line that just kind of shows you what I'm looking at. So you can see in the left corner, I've got kind of a steep contour line. So that's where you see really steep break. That would be a good area to look. There's also in the middle of the photo, there's kind of another steep area. That would be a good area to look, as well as in the middle, you can see that the steep break line that's on the left as it moves across the screen will taper off. And at that point, that's one of those high percentage areas where you start getting a tapered off contour line. And then on the far other side of the photograph, you can see that there's a point coming off of the break line. It's a deep point That's another type of isolated piece of structure that would be good to fish. Those are the high percentage areas that you're looking for. You don't want to just get on a break line and cover miles and miles of water and fish your way to those isolated parts of the break line that are going to be better than the others. So it's not that hard to break them down. From a bait choice, for me, I really like to fish crankbaits down the break line. I like to throw jerk baits. If it's more of a spring or fall period, jerk baits are phenomenal baits on break lines. Ned rigs, your drop shots. I like to throw jigs. A lot of times I'll stroke that jig down the break line. You want a bait that's going to cover some water, but you also want something that's going to get down to where those fish are at. To me, that seems like it's really beneficial. But don't let the break lines intimidate you, and don't overlook the break lines. Every lake out there has break lines. They're one of the most overlooked pieces of structure. And if you find those little gems on those break lines, those are going to be the pieces that get much less pressure because a lot of people aren't looking for them. So use that to your advantage. Cover some water that isn't as heavily pressured, and you'll find some of those sweet spots that'll help you catch more fish. So I hope this was helpful, guys. If it was, hit that like button, share it on your social media pages, and stay tuned for tomorrow's video. Thanks for watching.